Quite a few years ago, I was younger man. I went to boarding school in South Africa. And this boarding school was a mixed boarding school. I had girls and boys. And us being boys, well, we did what boys do, try to get into the girls' hostel, went camping, went hunting, caused trouble. And in between all that, we managed to put in some schoolwork as well. But anyway, one of the times, myself and a couple of my friends we played truant and went up into a mountain quite far away called Kranskop. We went camping for the weekend. I also had my first girlfriend as well. When she stayed behind at the school, me and myself and two other chaps, we went camping and spent the weekend camping on that mountain and came back to the school on the Monday. And I thought I'd write a story about that. It's not about me in general, but it could be. It's about an old fella coming back to the source, coming back to the place where he found his most happiness and find himself. And it could be about me, but could not be. I don't know. Anyway, this is a story about an old fella, the end of all his life, end of all he's been through and everything, coming back to the source, coming back to where it all began. Enjoy.
The hot African sun blazed down from a deep blue sky. The heat was singing intensely, using the insects as instruments of its warmth. The chirruping wings of their call filled the bush with sound. A lone eagle stood atop a huge mountain of rock, a fortress of geology, a landmark in the ocean of green that surrounded it, a mountain called Kranskop, and the source of many a local legend. On the tree, the perched eagle turned around and with an all-seeing eye caught sight of three khaki-clad figures moving towards him. Three boys with backpacks on their shoulders and laughing noisily and happily, breaking the cicada song and jarring the silence. Disgusted, he launched himself into the blue sky and took wing. "Look," one of the boys shouted, and pointed to the launch as they all stopped and gazed, envious of his effortless freedom. The one boy gazed over the expanse of the African bush. Three hikers in the middle of the African bush climbing this big mountain. He looked over the expanse of the African bush into the direction of the boarding school, where his girlfriend was no doubt thinking about him now, all blue eyes and soft curls. His companions, both classmates, urged him to climb the last huge boulder, where they proceeded to set up a rudimentary camp using their sheath knives. In no time at all, there was a small fire glowing. Then, gathering up their knives, after all great white hunters always carried knives, went out exploring. The African sun set down into the horizon as, laughing and swearing, they clambered up rocks, and they surprised a troop of baboons who shouted profusely at these intruders, scrambled currently to safety. Then the three boys went tracking the different types of antelope, using their rudimentary tracking skills for a few hours. And then, as the sun said goodbye below the horizon, they started back towards their safari camp. Now, the one boy who was elected to go and mount a raid on the local farm in the area. And what he did was, before he got all camoed up and put on his camouflage to go mount this farm raid, he put a picture of his girlfriend up on a rock around the campfire so she could see him, what he was doing now, even though it was just a photograph. Anyway, he manfully black-coloured his face using charcoal so he was blending into the dark, and stealthily made his way down the mountain. After about an hour, he arrived at the buildings of the farm, and he crept up to the chicken coop, where its residents dozed and muttered amongst themselves. A few roosters clucked with half-asleep chicken dreams, and suddenly the young boy appeared like a wraith at the door, grabbed one of their number, and in a sudden flurry of squawks, dog barkings, and with lights coming on in the farmhouse, he disappeared into the African darkness. Dispatching the hapless chicken with a flash of his knife, the young man climbed back up the mountain and, to the joy of his companions, presented dinner. That night a few beers were produced, as were cigarettes, and they came round the fire and they talked about the future, passing cigarettes around, and sipping beer. They talked in hushed tones about the future, that in a few short months they were all going to war, conscripted into the military to go fight a bush war in Angola. Talked about how we would become game rangers or big game hunters if we survived that war. The young boy, who was now the great white chicken hunter, talked about how we would become married one day, and wait for it. The blonde boy kept staring at the photograph propped onto a rock and illuminated by the flickering flames. Blonde girl's long legs and a lilting laughed. Even now she was cuddled up in the bed in the girls' hostel, reading his letter about his great safari he was now on with his two best mates. He couldn't wait to get back to her. And they'd only been going out for a few months. And he recalled how they first met. The class he was in was helping out at an air show over the weekend, a few short months ago. So every day, they were refueling planes and doing serious boy stuff. Anyway, after breakfast, after heading to the air show, he noticed this new young girl, newly arrived, and the focus of many gazes and thoughts of the young boys soon to become men. He put on his best James Dean walk, took a face from a movie, and sidled up to her, ready to use his best seductive drawl, when suddenly, as she got close, and those eyes skewered him, the whole facade just crumbled down to a stuttering nervous jabber and a ridiculous crab walk as the orbit of her presence took his breath and composure away in equal measure. They had the senior dance a few short weeks away, the farewell dance to the final year pupils, and nervously he asked her to be his date. And what was her name? Spearing him with her icy blue eyes, she said no, she didn't have a name, but seeing that he looked so pathetic, she would go with him to the dance. Joy abounded in his heart, and nervously he asked her to sit with him for a while before I had to go back to their hostels. All too fast it was over, and it was time to head to the airfield to help out. That day nothing was too much trouble, and he had never felt so happy. And as the sun set, they climbed back into the minibus for the drive back to school after the air show. He was overjoyed to find a letter from her in the foyer, as there was a postal service between the hostels, sanctioned by understanding teachers who knew all about young love, romance, boys, girls, and spring fever. The next day they met again, and he officially asked her to be his girlfriend, and he could scarcely believe it when with a twinkle in her eye she said yes. The next day they were staying at a hotel at the air show. It was the last day, over the weekend. And as a reward for all their hard work, the pilots agreed to take them for a flight in one of the aircraft to fly over the school. Excitedly, they all climbed into the cabin, and they set off into the wide blue African sky. Gazing out the window, they saw all the pupils lining up for the Saturday night movie outside the school hall, and leaning out of the open door, the young boy saw his girl waving excitedly up at him, and over the roar of the plane, he waved back at her back. Over the roar of the aircraft, they saw great herds of animals, great herd of wildebeest, flying over their huge big herds as they ran off into the sunset, and the beautiful green horizon before they landed back with a thud at the aircraft hangar. Next day it was back to school that was now a love song, and classes for the final exams. Every day the blonde boy, blonde girl would meet up after school, hold hands, and just love being a couple. They would go on long walks in the African bush, and they loved to send the letters that they eagerly waited to each other. And on that lonely mountain the firelight crackled as he thought about her under the African sky. Finally the day's excitement caught up with them, and climbing into their sleeping bags they fell into a contented sleep. They stayed on the mountain for 3 days, trekking, camping, and doing things that boys normally do, returning to school early Monday morning in time for class. Hitching back to school, they were offered a lift by a friendly farmer who complained that one of his prized chickens was abducted that night by either a jackal, an alien, or possibly a python. The boys said it was most likely a jackal. The blonde one was silent. Back at the school, she fell into his arms, and their delight at being back together was a joy to behold. This kind of love happens once and once only. Any other future love with its depth, intensity, and emotion is second act to this. The first love, the teenage love, this kind of love with all its hormones, age, and being in a boarding school as well, is a once only event. It was a night of the dance, and she glided up to him in a white dress with a blue sash, looking stunning. And he, with his sun-brown neck and arms, feeling strange in a suit. His parents were there, as with all the pupils at the dance invited to send the final year students into the world, away from the cocoon and home of the school with its rugby fields, teachers we loved, and hostels full of boys' grunts and girls' giggles. Their song that they chose for their relationship was a beautiful string quartet, and to their delight, the song was dedicated to them by the DJ, who was also the biology teacher, and so they got up to dance. He gazed into her young eyes and swore he would never leave her. He was going to fight for their future, and she in turn pressed her bodies against his, whispered, and together they shared a memory of a tree behind the school hall after the Saturday night movies, gazing up together at the stars, two bodies coiled up together, whispers. The music crooned in the background as this young couple, oblivious to the world, danced for all eternity. The day was here, it was time to leave. It seemed like an eternity. The young boy waited for the sound of his father's car coming to pick him up. His heart was breaking. He was leaving, off to the army. School was over. He was also scared. With a sound of finality, he heard and saw his father driving up to the hostel. He trudged down the stairs, sent a message to his girl, who came up from the hostel, and with tears running and silent sobs, they embraced each other for the last time. The last time their bodies would meet, last time their eyes would see each other as a couple, and the last minutes of a boarding school romance that was beautiful, intense, and the author of the most profound happiness. Both crying, they turned away, and under the hot African sun he crawled into his father's car, and with a crunch of tires started his journey into life. She stood crying as the dust of his passing hung heavy in the air. They never saw each other again. The old man drove. He drove like his life depended on it. Well, what little life that was left, that is. The old man was dying. The disease that was eating away his life force, like the car that was now eating up the tarmac, was a real and tangible thing. Not some dry words in a medical journal or a crying face in a TV soap. No, it was a reality. A real fact of life, as real as breathing. Yet he felt content at ease. He felt he was moving into the light, as life to him was colours. The pink of childhood, the red of puberty, the blue of a 20-something loud boy, the green of middle age, then the slow fade to grey of an advancing old age, then the white of spiritual growth, and the wisdom of all those years coalescing into the certainty of the fact that as our body dissolves, our spirit evolves, ready for the second birth. It was this that sustained him as the black night sped past the car windows, and the headlights illuminated the snake of the white centre line as it slithered under the wheels of the car, appearing again under the back wheels on his endless journey. Yet the old man was happy, stupidly happy in fact. This was the culmination of a wild, colourful life. All his dreams had been realised, and his seed had been well and truly sown in his head, and his memories still alive and vibrant. He had re-entered the country a few days previously on this, his last safari, and he was alone. After a few hours, he suddenly noticed the sign in the headlights of the little town where his old school was such a feature. Yes, he was coming back to the source, back to where he was the happiest he could ever remember being. He stopped the car and got out. The stars were like a celestial river going across the sky, and he wondered at the fact that a lifetime ago he held her in his arms and looked up at the same audience of stars that had not left the theatre. the moon shining down in profound reflection. A jackal hounded its mournful banshee wail as he turned towards the west, where he knew Kranskop would now be looming above the horizon, invisible now in the dark. A satellite arced high above, beeping softly to itself, communicating its messages, a denizen of the new world, replacing the telegraph poles that line the road, pointing up at the sky like accusing fingers, the same poles that hummed with the emotions of voices on the phone, empty poles, dead wires, voices that are now silent. With a sigh, he got back into the car, and with a soft click, closed the door. With a purr and crunch of tires, the car commenced eating the road. The exit left came up ahead, so he indicated, then turned right into the long loop that led to the tiny little village, with his destination next to it. After a while, with the African bush dark and silent outside his windows, he discerned lights winking through the trees. Here it was, the tiny village hotel, and even now he could remember the sound of the clinks of glass and music as the farmers held one of their numerous parties, and him himself and his mates outside in the bushes drinking illicit beers, wanting to join in, but unable to do so. Now the hotel was derelict, deserted, and silent. He drove past a tiny station where the steam train would arrive at midnight after the long journey north. Full of pupils returning from holidays and weekends at home, platforms full of excited voices, blue jeans and glowing cigarettes as they started the walk back to the school hostels in the near distance. She would meet him there sometimes, and in the moonlight they would be overjoyed to see each other again. And wildly happy was set off for the school, holding hands. Now the tracks were overgrown and the station dark and empty. He passed a little shop where they would sneak down through the farmlands at night to buy food, cigarettes, and occasionally alcohol. That too was deserted. He drove through the tiny settlement, and suddenly there they were, the open gates and driveway leading to the derelict school buildings and hostels looming amongst the trees. They too were silent and deserted. He remembered the school closing many years ago and hearing about it, and was silently dismayed now to see the undergrowth reclaiming the boardwalks and passages that once echoed with young laughter, hopes and dreams. He parked the car and got out, grabbed a torch and a little stereo from the boot. He approached the main hall and went around the back. He remembered a tree, a couple lying under the tree, staring up at the moon. There it was. And with a tear that escaped about the same time as his whisper, he discerned the faint carving on its bark. Almost gone now, but still there. A carving echoed by thousands of trees and subways the world over. 2 initials closed by a heart. He stared at the tree for a long time, lost in his own movie and thoughts. Suddenly he turned and started walking back, his footsteps echoing the silence. Hello, the voice was terribly loud, and he spun on his heel. And he was surprised to see an elderly black man standing on the catwalk. Could it be? Simeon, the old farm manager from all those years ago. They recognized each other immediately and embraced like old brothers. They talked and remembered those far-off days. Yes, she was beautiful, the old man said, and the old black man agreed with a twinkle. And yes, he remembered her. Remembered when he introduced himself to her as the farm manager and the young blond man who was now the old man, looking on proudly. They talked for over an hour under the eaves of the catwalk. How the world had moved on, had become virtually unrecognizable, and was now so distant to these old men of the past that they no longer wanted to be any part of it. Suddenly the old man stood up. It was getting late now, and he had some things to do. They gazed into each other's faces in the dark, solemnly shook hands, and parted. The dining hall was empty. Dust clung to the windowsills, and ghosts sat at the tables and chairs. He put the stereo on the table and inserted a battered old cassette tape. The silence was jolted as the first soothing chords of the song started to dance around the empty hall. He started to dance, his old body flowing a slow waltz. She was in his arms. He could feel her body as the music swelled, voices all around them as other couples joined them. She looks into his eyes with the power that beautiful girls have, and her lips move. A flash goes off as a photographer, who was also a teacher, catches them dancing, to be put in this local school magazine later on. The music swells and moves. She moves with him. Laughter, swelling of voices and glassing. Music cascading like a symphony as they danced among the other couples. Happy, young, full of life in the future. She looks deep into his eyes, and slowly her perfect face breaks into a lovely smile. I love you. Suddenly it's gone. It is silent. She's no longer there. The song keeps on playing. Emptiness, darkness and dust rushes back in. He stands alone on the floor with a steady clack of the cassette tape mutters in the darkness. Sobs shake his body, and with footsteps echoing on the floor, he walks slowly towards the empty door, and the sound of his footsteps fade away down the catwalk. The sound of the music player keeps on playing, and as the music fades away and the batteries suddenly start to go flat, his tiny light flickers bravely on the cassette, and then it too is silent. The sound of the car suddenly starting up, tires crunching, as the car fades away into the background and into the night. It is getting late now. Dawn is still a few hours away, and there's still a lot to do. He plans to be departed by sunset, and with a contented feeling he embarks on the last road of this last safari. He parks the car in a shopping mall parking lot of the farming town he knew so well, and gazed up at the huge looming Balkokranskop in the distance. This was a hired car, so he will find out soon enough where it is, which by that time he will not care. He opens a boot, takes out a small rucksack, throws the keys into the front cubby hole, takes a long look back at his old life, and starts walking. The town is still asleep, and only the occasional farmer could be seen walking down the streets. He walks to the outskirts and crosses a barbed wire fence into the field that once held cows and sheep, but now just a huge concrete mindless housing estate. He passes through that and carries on walking for hours in the dark through the bush, and eventually the sun peeked over the horizon, climbing higher and higher as the world came to life. The Kranskop got bigger and bigger, and at last it was there in front of him, filling his vision. Straight away he saw the crevice where a lifetime ago 3 young boys started their adventure. He started to climb. It was close now. His final goodbye. He had stopped taking his medication a few weeks previously, and the disease inside him grew and roared as if relishing its newfound freedom. Now it was preparing for a final assault. He had to reach the top before it claimed him. Far above, a lone eagle, perched on his fortress of rock, gazed around, searching for prey, then noticed the old man struggling up the rocks before him. With a cry that is the sound of the wilderness worldwide, the eagle launched itself into the sky, then circled round, gazing down at the figure of the old man staring up at him. The old man gazed skyward, suddenly remembered that same sound all those years ago. Then he was young, blonde, tanned, and wildly happy. The eagle cried once more, then flew off. He continued climbing until he came across a rock that still lay where it had landed after being thrown off the top by a muscular young blonde boy a lifetime ago. He sat on the rock and lit his pipe, started to think about his journey, then lying back across the rock, looked up at the cobalt blue African sky. His eyelids fell down, and sleep claimed him. He couldn't remember the last time he had slept. The sun blazed down and continued its lazy arc across the sky as the old man lay on the rock he had thrown on as a young boy all those years ago. She was in his arms, dancing and laughing. Then he was hot. Sleep left him, and the day came rushing back, and he opened his eyes. He felt ill, very ill. In fact, he instinctively knew he had but a short time left. He continued climbing, and after many hours as the day prepared to hand over the night, he reached the top. There it was, the huge panorama of the African bush ahead of him, as it was the same again all those years ago. The school on the horizon, and the setting sun catching its far-off windows. The little clearing was still there, where they had camped, and the gnarled old thorn tree was still overhanging it. Happily smiling, he unpacked his rucksack and gathered enough branches to start a small fire, and packed a faded old photograph and rested it upon the same rock that it had rested when it was fresh and colourful. He sighed and lay back, watching the sun create the light show as it bathed the African savannah with a golden shower. The fire crackled contentedly as he looked up at the stars that he was soon to join. Far away, a baboon started to shout. They shouted their territorial challenge. The difference is that those baboons were going to wake up in the morning where he had no intention to. It was close. The disease was coming to claim him. And just to be sure, he had packed some pills with him to give the disease some help, but he didn't need them. He felt it. The flames crackled at night. The stars came out. And then he saw her through a tunnel, walking towards him through the darkness. He held her hand, ran his fingers through her hair, and gazed at her as she knelt opposite him. Her voice was gentle, and he didn't notice the blood that was now streaming down his face from his nose and his ears. He smiled, and they talked and talked. She cradled him and loved him. He cradled her and loved back. His gallant old heart was crying now. Then all of a sudden, in a final spasm, it stilled. The flames of the fire flared up momentarily as if a breath had passed through it, then settled down. Suddenly the screech of a giant eagle owl howled through the sky. Pierced the night, the harbinger of death. The local indigenous population believed and spoke about as they huddled through the ages and around innumerable campfires about the owl that announced the passing of a great spirit. The owl flew over this campfire a few times, looking down at the motionless figure, then flew off into the night with Kranskop slowly disappearing into the background, the fire growing ever smaller into the distance before winking out altogether, the huge bulk of the mountain rising like a castle over the bush. Epilogue. Newspaper article, July 2028. Farmers News. The unidentified car found in a supermarket car park has been identified as a hired car from Johannesburg Airport. The occupant has not been traced, and searches are ongoing. It is believed the person flew into South Africa the same day that the car was hired and driven to its present location. Epilogue 2. The body of an unidentified male was discovered on the summit of a well-known landmark known as Kranskop, a huge buttress of rock in the African savannah. The man was elderly, and he had died of a heart disease, and it appeared he had intentionally gone there. The man was also linked to the abandoned car that was found a few months previously. And he was also the subject of a comprehensive search. A faded photograph and a rucksack were found at the scene. A few blonde hairs were found in his hand, and they matched the DNA of the girl shown in the photograph. She had passed away 40 years previously. The case is now closed. Having no next of kin, the body is to be cremated and the ashes scattered at the site. The hot African sun still gazes down on that huge mountain. The eagle still calls and the baboons still bark. Yet there is now a man on that mountain, a man who came back to the source, back to the beginning, back to what made him and shaped him, and sent him on a huge circular route that encompassed most of the world. And after decades of a fantastic marriage, career, and success, he came back to where true happiness was once and once only ever felt. The biggest, most heartfelt tombstone in the world.